So transgenders basically, for the most part, if you didn't know, right? So hopefully this is good for consultants to learn, lah. Yeah. If you have clients which are transgendered, there is a difference between formal transgender and non-formal transgender. Yeah. So what I mean by this is very simple. Let's say if you have a client who was biologically female, okay, and then transitioned to a male, right? Okay, so in appearance, male already, whatever, right? But if it doesn't say so on the IC, it doesn't mean shit, in a nutshell. So when it comes to the insurance and financial planning, unfortunately, it has to be taken by biological sex, right? Now, why did I include the formal and non-formal is because in Singapore, it is possible to be medically to have your gender medically changed. It means that you can actually go from your IC change, you can go from female to male, you can have both your name and your gender changed formally in Singapore, which is actually a lot more progressive than people think. I would say it came as a huge shock to me also. So I was actually kind of impressed, right? And so what normally you would have to do in order to facilitate this change is that you have to prove a certain amount of surgery as well as hormone treatments, and then your levels have to be at basically what would be appropriate for that particular range, right? So for example, if let's say I'm transitioning from a female to a male and I want to be recognized biologically, medically, I want to make the switch, I want it to appear on my IC, so on and so forth, then a doctor can certify that as long as I meet some of the biological requirements, and then obviously meeting those biological requirements will require me to take a certain amount of medication or surgery, so on and so forth, and then you can actually clear it. It means that there are quite a few transgenders, I would say, that have actually medically cleared it and then they are formally on board. So it's very important when you are consulting for someone and they tell you, okay, I'm transgender. You gotta ask them whether they like it or not to some degree, whether it's formal and informal, right? Because that makes a humongous amount of difference in terms of, for example, basic insurance concepts like how much the insurance will cost, right? So, for example, females usually get charged lower for life insurance, but they get charged higher for critical illness insurance, right? So obviously, if you have formally been had your gender changed out, right, then that implication applies to you, and then if you didn't, then you have to stick with whatever your biological sex implies in terms of basic things like your costs, right? And then obviously the insurance itself is a factor, yeah. Insurance companies can and will take those changes. Means that as long as it says on your IC that you're male, doesn't matter whether you're a biological female, as long as it says male, they'll take you as a male, and it will clear. Yeah, so I do have clients which have cleared insurance, not an issue. The other issue that comes into play, right, is not the transition itself, but what occurred during the transition. So for example, let's say if the person in question is still on hormonal treatments with extremely negative side effects, which actually does happen. Like basically, having spoken to a couple of transgenders myself, usually there is a certain quality, means that higher quality hormonal treatment and lower quality hormonal treatment will result in a range of side effects. So the more expensive the thing, generally the lower the side effects. For the most part, that's an issue because obviously if when you declare medication, like as a transgender person, then the insurance company is like, okay, like this particular medication could have a certain amount of longer term effects if you're still on this thing, right? And so as a result, they may kind of load up your insurance. They can make it more unfavorable. They can even reject your case. Overall, this does happen as well. Yeah, so it's not just that people change formally and get accepted. Sometimes they get rejected as well due to these particular reasons. Normally, you would have to stave off the medication for a while. And to kind of touch on a slightly darker, grittier topic, I would say that if you went through the process, whether formal or non-formal, to really kind of change your gender in Singapore, right? Not to mention that this is not a country that has amazing living conditions in terms of affordability, right? So it's a very decent chance that you were doing all of this while you were living with your parents, or you were living in not the best conditions, or you had to live on your own, so on and so forth, right? So I would say that in my very limited experience, there has not been a single transgender client that I've had who has not briefly had depression. Formally diagnosed with depression, formal depression medication, right? And so depression medication generally is quite a killer for insurance companies. Means that they normally wouldn't insure you for somewhere between 1 to 3 years. Best is 5, means that if it's been 5 years off the medication, you'll probably be treated as normal, right? But normally 1 to 3 years, they kind of will give you a pretty rough time. Yeah, if you've not been off the medication for a long enough period. It's kind of dark in that sense, but I think it's important to acknowledge because you want to kind of be mentally prepared for it. So, for example, my first transgender client, so he told me that, basically he was depressed for a while, and I was like, and so it kind of shows on my face that I was like, okay, like why, right? And it should have been relatively obvious because it's not a very easy thing to do or be, or like the kind of I would say most transgenders generally describe the feeling of wanting to transition as something that is somewhat burdensome, means that they feel a very, very heavy weight and desire and discomfort with themselves, and they kind of endure this for like years and years and years, right? So to some degree, they're quite depressed if they don't do any kind of counseling at the very least, right? And so you don't want it to be a situation where someone tells you that, okay, I'm on depression medication, and then your face is like, oh, like judgy and some shit, right? Because it happens, and so as a consultant, you want to make sure that you're prepared for this mentally, right? So you do understand that these are some of the common repercussions. You should ask about that person's medication or previous medication if you didn't, right? Because sometimes you can have a transgender client which is perfectly healthy, but they had a history of years and years of medication. Right, so it means that basically they've never had cancer, they've never had diabetes, never had nothing, healthy as AF, never been to a hospital for anything aside from non-formal treatments, right? Or they may not even have gone to a hospital, right? And so as a result, you'll be like, oh, okay, so I can just fill out all underwriting questions as basically this person's healthy, but if you don't ask about the medication specifically, then you may end up screwing your client over, right? And so it's important for you to kind of know this, right? I would say that it's very, very important to know that this is some of the general issues that you normally face with transgender clients and what kind of questions you should ask so that you are able to really do the best job you can for them.